The thunder crashed over Rome like the roar of a wrathful deity, yet even the heavens' rage could not smother the shrieks seeping from beyond the emperor's hidden chamber. Marble halls shivered with sound, not of war, not of heated debate, but of something far more sinister. Senator Lucius Marcus stood paralyzed in place, a torch blazing in his trembling grip, its glow quivering across polished stone walls. His breath slipped in shallow bursts, and though he longed to close his eyes, guards on either side murmured their order with chilling calm. "Keep it steady, Senator. The Emperor needs proper light." Behind that massive door waited no ritual, no banquet, no council of state, only the crushing of purity masked as imperial entitlement. A girl, scarcely 14, ceased being a daughter, ceased being a child, ceased being human. She became an entry in a record, a tally in a scroll, a statistic in the empire's engine of indulgence. And the patriarchs of Rome, men who once led armies, forged laws, and carried honor in the forum, now stood as bearers of flame for their daughter's ruin. The empire that once conquered nations had turned inward, devouring its own families. This was not legend, this was not gossip, this was fact. The most nightmarish sexual practices of Caligula the Deranged. When the death of Tiberius crept through the marble corridors of Rome in March 37 CE, the city exhaled with a collective relief that felt almost like rebirth after decades of suffocation. For 23 relentless years, the empire had staggered beneath the weight of Tiberius's suspicion, his paranoid glances, his endless treason trials, and the silent passageways where whispers alone could summon execution. The Senate had grown exhausted from walking on blades. The citizens had forgotten the taste of joy and leadership, and the Praetorian Guard sought a new light to follow. That light emerged in the form of a youth whose very name promised destiny. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known to soldiers and common folk alike as Caligula, or Little Boots, a nickname he had earned as a child, following his father, the cherished General Germanicus, across the muddy camps of battlefields. To Romans, he was not merely an emperor by lineage, he was the heir of Augustus, the grandson of Hope, the boy raised amid the smell of leather tents and iron blades rather than secluded palaces, the prince of soldiers who had walked among common men. His rise was celebrated with fireworks of relief, and the forum thundered with the cheers of citizens who finally dared to believe dignity might return to Rome. Caligula, in those first months, seemed to justify every radiant hope. He entered the capital not with the bitterness of a paranoid tyrant, but with the warmth of youth and the generosity of one eager for love. He granted bonuses to the legions, cut taxes that had long suffocated the poor, and staged colossal gladiatorial contests that drenched the Colosseum in the blood of spectacle for days on end. The Senate praised his speeches and whispered among themselves that perhaps at last Rome had a ruler who fused the charisma of Julius with the kindness of Augustus. Even hardened senators wept as he strode into the Curia, convinced they had been delivered from the darkness of Tiberius's cruelty. They penned prayers of gratitude, sacrifices filled the sanctuaries, and in the marketplaces people spoke of him as the dawn after a long winter. The empire had waited too long for someone who smiled, who laughed, who seemed mortal, yet behind the marble mask of youthful promise, strands of a darker design had already begun weaving into the fabric of his reign. At first it was scarcely visible, like a faint crack that appears in a flawless statue, small enough to ignore untid. Time deepens it into a fracture. A servant girl disappeared from the palace kitchens. The steward claimed she had fled in fear of punishment, but murmurs spread that her corpse had surfaced downstream in the Tiber, scarred with wounds so obscene even hardened guards refused to describe them. Then 2 more slaves vanished, a boy of 15 and a girl of 17, and when their bodies floated back into the city's river with faces frozen in eternal torment, those who saw turned silently away. The palace offered no explanation. The emperor grinned in public as though nothing had occurred, and Rome, drunk on its own relief, chose to dismiss the whispers. After all, was he not still young? Was it not natural that a man of command would test the edges of his pleasures? Surely time would steady his appetites. Surely he would grow into responsibility. These were the rationalizations the Senate muttered among themselves, each phrase an attempt to conceal the dread already quickening beneath their skin. The unveiling came fully in October of 37 CE, 6 months into his reign, when Caligula was struck by a sudden and baffling sickness. The entire empire froze as reports spread of his fever, his delirium, and his body writhing between life and death. In every sanctuary, priests slaughtered oxen and poured wine upon the altars, while ordinary citizens lifted trembling prayers, begging the gods not to steal their young sovereign. Even hardened soldiers who had mocked omens and ridiculed prophets found themselves whispering invocations to Mars and Jupiter, desperate for the survival of the man who had so swiftly captured their devotion. When finally Caligula rose from his sickbed weeks later, pale yet alive, Rome exploded in rejoicing. Animals were sacrificed in gratitude. Families held feasts in his name, and the Senate declared the recovery a miracle of divine favor. Yet those nearest to him insist. The man who stepped out from illness was not the same as the man who had first worn the purple. The fever had burned something within him, leaving behind not humility, but the icy belief that he had touched death and returned immortal. From that day forward, he no longer considered himself mere flesh, bound by law or morality, but a living deity, for whom limits of human decency no longer held meaning. At first, his appetites hid behind the splendor of palace banquets. Senators' wives began to receive summons to dine privately with the emperor, summons that could not be declined and which their husbands dared not confront. Young boys from noble bloodlines found themselves granted the honor of serving in the palace, only to discover that honor meant rouge upon their faces and silk wrapped around their bodies, reshaping them into ornaments of humiliation. Still, the city turned away, muttering that he was merely youthful, that indulgence would vanish with age. But indulgence did not vanish. It solidified into custom. He began filling the palace guard not with men of integrity, but with those chosen for brutality. Soldiers whose loyalty was secured by shared corruption rather than military oath. He appointed a freedman named Helen as his master of pleasures, a man who quickly learned that survival depended on procuring whatever, no matter how vile, the emperor craved. By summer of 38 CE, the faint fractures in Caligula's mask split wide open. In the imperial archives, a new kind of record appeared, not for grain tallies or tax accounts, but for human acquisitions. Each entry was marked with the same precise detail the empire used to catalog resources, except now the resources were women and children, daughters of senators, wives of equestrians, sons of merchants, each reduced to a number, stripped of identity, transformed into inventory. Rome, which once boasted of it as civilization, was now collapsing into a marketplace of dignity, auctioned at the whim of one man. What had begun as hidden cruelty was taking shape as public policy, and the torchlight that filled the palace at night would soon reveal horrors that not even Rome, with its legacy of excess, had imagined. What began as whispers in palace corridors soon hardened into the iron machinery of state-sanctioned terror. For Caligula's lusts were never content to remain behind doors or curtains. They grew like infection, spreading from shadow into the bloodstream of Rome itself until what had once been private indulgence became official procedure. What had once been sudden cruelty was turned into imperial doctrine, and what had once been whispered as gossip was now written by scribes with quills, tallying human suffering with the same detachment used for grain or coin. The imperial records began swelling with a new kind of scroll, leather-bound volumes with no mention of commerce or conquest, but only lists of names reduced to numbers. Each entry a stripping of body and soul into mere inventory, a bureaucratic invention that concealed one man's appetite behind the mask of administration. In those ledgers, daughters of Rome became catalogued property, their ages and beauty noted with the cold precision of an accountant's hand, and in the process, the empire's soul began to rot within. Senators who once strode proudly in the forum now crept through palace halls with haunted eyes, for they knew their families had become both bargaining chips and weapons in the emperor's game of power. To oppose him in debate meant to see a daughter's name appear in the ledger within days. To resist attacks meant to watch a wife summoned for imperial service, and to remain silent meant only to delay the inevitable. For Caligula's hunger was not appeased by strangers, but by the breaking of those untouchable, the dest. Ruction of precisely those bonds that had secured Rome for centuries. When the first torches were thrust into senators' trembling hands, commanding them to light the scenes of their own children's violation, the transformation of cruelty into governance was complete. Because the horror no longer targeted bodies alone, but reached into the very psyche of Rome, forcing fathers into accomplices and mothers into silent witnesses until the empire itself was corrupted at its core. Palace architects were ordered to design chambers not of elegance, but of acoustics, ensuring screams carried into neighboring halls, where those awaiting their fate could not escape the sound of what awaited. Torch brackets were measured at exact heights, calculated so men forced to hold them could see without obstruction, for the emperor demanded that witnesses were as essential as victims, that degradation meant nothing unless observed, recorded, and shared. The guards drilled their duties with military rigidity, instructing senators where to stand, how high to raise their flames, how long to remain still, warning that a wavering arm or a whispered protest would bring another daughter's name etched into the ledger as reprisal. And so the mightiest men of Rome, whose ancestors had paraded in triumphs and written laws for nations, now stood reduced to shaking torchbearers, their once commanding voices silenced into shallow breaths, their honor traded for survival. In this way, the Roman Empire ceased being an empire of conquest and became an empire of internal terror, because when the highest families had been reduced to silence and submission, what chance remained for merchants, for peasants, or for slaves? The city murmured of vanishings, of noble women who entered the palace never to be seen. Again, of sons from proud households who returned painted and perfumed, their identities erased, their childhoods sacrificed upon the altar of imperial lust. Each tale spread through taverns and marketplaces like wildfire, yet none dared to challenge it, because all knew that even voicing the truth could draw notice, and notice meant entry in the ledger, and entry meant annihilation of dignity. The brilliance of Caligula's design lay not only in the destruction of bodies, but in the dismantling of society's will to resist. By forcing the most powerful fathers to be complicit in their own family's torment, he transformed them from rivals into captives, shackled by chains of shame and silence. The ledgers themselves, fragments of which survive in archaeological finds, reveal the clinical nature of this nightmare. They speak of acquisition dates, of compliance scores, of categories that sound like the jargon of trade rather than chronicles of torment. Victims were measured in terms of usefulness, their worth ranked by beauty, age, or political weight. The language stripped them of humanity, reducing them to columns and codes. Item 247, one line reads, female, senatorial class, restricted assignment. Behind those sterile words lay a life ruined, a family crushed, a father forced to stand and illuminate the unspeakable. But within that cold precision lies Caligula's true invention. He had converted atrocity into bureaucracy, evil into efficiency, cruelty into a system that could be scaled and preserved. By the early months of 39 CE, the transformation was unmistakable. What began as whispers in the night had hardened into a functioning institution of horror. The guards were trained, the architects had built, the scribes recorded with tireless detachment, and the senators, men once sworn to uphold Rome's dignity, now shuffled through corridors holding torches that revealed not only their daughter's agony, but the collapse of their civilization's soul. Private depravity had become public decree, and the empire had crossed a threshold from which it could never return. Among all the degradations Caligula inflicted upon Rome, none cut deeper into its marrow than his calculated violation of family. For while his early hungers consumed senators' wives and merchants' daughters, his true obsession turned inward, toward his own blood, toward Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger, women who carried Augustus's lineage in their veins, women who should have embodied the untouchable heart of Rome's dignity. To defile strangers was tyranny, but to defile his own sisters in full view of the Senate was something darker still. A spectacle staged not merely for lust, but to declare that nothing was beyond his reach, not even the sacred bonds of Roman family life. This was the stage upon which Caligula revealed the breadth of his madness, transforming incest into a weapon of politics, desecration into theater, and humiliation into ritualized power. The unveiling came not behind locked doors, but in the blazing light of a banquet witnessed by 300 senators, priests, and foreign envoys. The dining hall shimmered with golden lamps. Musicians plucked strings to smother the guests' unease, and senators forced smiles as trays of delicacies passed. But the atmosphere collapsed into suffocating silence when Caligula, reclining at the head, seized the hand of his sister Drusilla and pulled her close in a gesture that shattered every law of Rome, every taboo of civilization, every line etched by centuries of tradition. The room froze. Men stared into their wine. Women clutched goblets until their knuckles whitened, and the air seemed to vibrate with the knowledge that this was not mere scandal, but sacrilege. Then Caligula's voice carried across the chamber, calm and deliberate. My divine sisters, blessed by Jupiter himself to share my affection as Juno shares his. The invocation of Jupiter's incestuous marriage to Juno was no accident. By summoning Rome's king of gods, he converted his violation into religious precedent, trappeing senators between two impossible choices, applaud sacrilege or commit treason, and so they clapped, their hollow applause echoing through marble halls as their daughters' fates were sealed by their silence. The bond between Caligula and Drusilla had been rumored even before that night, for during the fever that nearly killed him in 37 CE, she alone had been allowed to remain in his chamber, tending him while physicians and priests were dismissed. When he recovered, he proclaimed her not merely his sister, but his divine counterpart, raising her into the quarters of wives and banishing her husband to a remote governorship that served as exile softened only by distance. Their intimacy was no longer concealed, and as months passed, Drusilla became the centerpiece of his rituals, seated beside him during morning audiences when senators pleaded petitions, presiding with him at religious rites, treated not as a mortal woman but as priestess and consort, forced nightly into degradations that mocked Roman values. Julia Livilla, fiery in spirit, attempted defiance until punishment silenced her, while Agrippina, colder and cunning, buried her fury and stored every humiliation like coins saved for vengeance. But for the moment, resistance was futile, for Rome itself had become Caligula's stage, and his sisters were trapped as unwilling actresses in his theater of desecration. When Drusilla became pregnant, Caligula's madness reached its apex. Draped in purple and gold, he stood before the Senate and proclaimed that the child in her womb was no ordinary life, but the son of a god, his heir destined to rule both heaven and earth. Senators who once shaped empires now bowed like priests at an altar, passing decrees of honor for an unborn child conceived in incest, celebrated as miracle. Priests slaughtered oxen in temples, citizens were ordered to pray for the infant, and Rome, a city once proud of its law and dignity, applauded the desecration of its own moral foundations, mistaking perversion for divine spectacle. Yet fate intervened, and in June of 38 CE, Drusilla died suddenly. Some whispered of childbirth gone wrong, others of poison, slipped by hands too broken by humiliation to endure more. The truth, like so much of Caligula's Rome, was buried with her. His grief did not soften him. It obliterated his last trace of humanity. He declared Drusilla a goddess, erected temples in her name, commanded oaths sworn by her divinity, and demanded that the Roman people worship the very victim he had destroyed. Julia Livilla and Agrippina did not escape torment in her absence. It multiplied. Now they were forced to impersonate their dead sister, compelled to wear her robes, to speak her words, to embody her spirit in ceremonies that twisted mourning into grotesque parody. To resist was death. To comply was to surrender their souls. Witnesses later swore that senators were summoned to watch as Caligula proclaimed, "If I can do this to my sisters, imagine what awaits your daughters." The message was carved into their bones. No law, no tradition, no bond could shield them from his will. Even these ceremonies were logged in ledgers with bureaucratic coldness, dates and witnesses listed beside notations of outcome, as though sacred family ties were no different than grain inventories. Sisters became property, wives became currency, children became entries, and Rome itself became complicit. What made Caligula's desecration most devastating was not only his violation of flesh, but his poisoning of the very concept of family. For centuries, the household had been Rome's cornerstone, the sacred bond between paterfamilias and kin. By turning his sisters into consorts and his daughter into a goddess, Caligula shattered that cornerstone, proving that even Rome's most sacred ties could be recast as weapons of power. And the empire, instead of revolting, remained silent, applauding when commanded, bowing when ordered, racor. Ding horror, as procedure. In that silence, Rome betrayed itself more deeply than in any war lost to foreign foes, for in Caligula's reign, incest was not private depravity, it was public decree. It was humiliation turned into ritual. It was the proclamation that nothing, not family, not tradition, not morality, stood above the hunger of a man who believed himself divine. His true innovation lay not merely in indulging forbidden lusts, but in cloaking his appetites in the garments of law and record-keeping, converting vice into an institution. The east wing of the palace bore the mark of this innovation. Ceilings painted with goddesses and nymphs concealed what was called the Temple of Divine Service, a place where marble statues and incense disguised exploitation as piety. Wives and daughters of senators were not worshippers but offerings, their degradation dressed as ritual. To a casual visitor, it appeared a sanctuary of holiness, filled with hymns and smoke. But behind the curtain, the machinery of abuse churned with the precision of a treasury office. Every act was tallied, every body catalogued, every humiliation preserved in duplicate records. The genius of this system was how it ensnared Rome's elite. Those hungry for imperial favor were handed ivory tokens etched with times and chamber numbers, requiring them to attend ceremonies where their wives' dignity was traded for protection, their daughters' purity for contracts. Silence became the currency of survival. Ledgers recorded each appointment as though it were Senate roll call, noting performance, enthusiasm, even revenue generated. These documents ensured no senator could ever rise in protest, for the archives preserved their complicity in ink and wax, a permanent record of shame that became Caligula's ultimate insurance. He devoured not only bodies, but reputations. Once a man had stood by while his wife or child was processed in the temple, he could never again claim virtue. Thus, the guardians of Roman law became prisoners of the ear-own silence, blackmailed into obedience by evidence of their corruption. Yet even this systemized exploitation did not quench Caligula's appetite, for his imagination was not satisfied with consuming the present. He sought to guarantee a future harvest of victims. And thus was born the breeding program, Rome's most unspeakable experiment, a machine that reduced human reproduction into an industrial process. Physicians trained in Alexandria, men who had once sworn oaths to heal, now stood as butchers cloaked in scholarly robes. They measured women like livestock, noting hips, fertility cycles, and bloodlines, dictating unions not by love, but by arithmetic. Daughters of Rome's oldest families were paired with soldiers, gladiators, even foreign captives, each match engineered for strength, beauty, or exotic novelty. These unions, forced beneath the eyes of guards and scribes, were catalogued with chilling detachment, each entry another victory of cruelty disguised as order. Pregnancies became state projects. Diets were prescribed, movements restricted, miscarriages punished, births tallied as inventory. Infants were seized from their mothers' arms and stamped with destinies, strong boys for the legions, delicate ones for palace service, beautiful girls for temple ritual, the rest discarded into labor. Families dissolved into categories, bloodlines were dissected into functions, birth itself was stripped of sanctity and reduced to a cog in Caligula's machine. Yet perhaps the most grotesque perversion was reserved for the noble boys of Rome, heirs who should have carried the Republic's legacy, instead remade into painted ornaments for the emperor's amusement. In the north wing, mirrored chambers reflected their destruction. Attendants bathed them in oils, plucked away their childhood, and dressed them in silks that mocked their stolen manhood. Their voices were trained to break into false sweetness, their steps rehearsed into the glide of courtesans. Names like Marcus or Lucius were erased, replaced with Flora, Lily, Rose, flowers planted in the soil of humiliation. In the archives they were no longer sons, but male attendants, ranked by beauty, grace, and obedience. Senators were forced to rank these children of their peers, to mark their own shame in ink. To resist was to face punishment. To comply was to watch their future heirs broken before their eyes. The ledgers from this era, fragments of which survive, reveal the icy precision of this system. Columns of ages, classifications, revenues, even notes suggesting optimization. One scribe recommended increasing supply before festivals. Another praised higher returns from younger categories. A third suggested narcotics to pacify the defiant. The language reads not like crime, but commerce, as if agony itself could be managed for profit. By the end of 39 CE, the palace had ceased to resemble a seat of empire. It had become a factory of exploitation, with departments for procurement, processing, breeding, training, each operating with the precision of a military campaign. Guards acquired, physicians measured, scribes documented, senators enforced silence. What had begun as private depravity had metastasized into public institution, and the family, the sacred cornerstone of Rome, was dissolved into categories of utility and compliance. Nothing remained sacred, not birth, not lineage, not childhood, not even gender, for everything could be rewritten, reassigned, reduced to numbers on parchment. Rome's citizens still dined, traded, and prayed in temples, but the true empire was being recorded in ledgers that transformed flesh into figures and suffering into statistics. Yet if one ritual defined the collapse of Rome's soul more than any other, it was the invention of the torchbearer's duty. A practice so calculated, so devastating, it turned fathers into accomplices, forcing them to illuminate the very annihilation of their daughters. To hold the torch outside Caligula's chamber was not merely to provide light, it was to stand motionless, forbidden to intervene, forbidden even to look away, condemned to witness horror with no escape. At dawn, a summons would arrive, sealed with the imperial mark, commanding a senator to present his eldest daughter and prepare himself for illumination duty. The letter was bureaucratic, its words cold and detached, yet behind those lines lay a family's ruin. Refusal meant death, not just of the father, but the extermination of his entire household, brothers executed, wives enslaved, children scattered like spoils of war. Compliance was not choice, but sentence. The corridor where fathers waited stretched like a tomb, each flicker of torchlight reminding them that survival demanded silence, and silence demanded complicity. 50 feet of marble, iron sconces in perfect intervals, each torch placed with mathematical precision so that when the chamber doors opened, the flames would fall directly on the bodies inside. The architecture itself was a weapon, designed so that no father could ever look away from his own child's destruction. Guards paced the corridor, barking reminders, "Keep your arms steady, do not falter." To falter was to invite punishment worse than death. Some fathers whispered lines of Virgil to escape their minds. Others recited equations to drown the screams. But nothing could silence what bled through those oak doors. Muffled cries, breaking voices, and the mocking laughter of an emperor. Men whose ancestors once commanded legions now stood as statues, holding torches that burned brighter than their lost honor. They became shadows of themselves, while their daughters disappeared into chambers they would never leave whole again. On the walls, trembling hands left graffiti. "We are the damned who breathe, the D, and who walk." Another scratched, "May the gods forgive what emperors compel." Centuries later, archaeologists found these words still carved into stone, testaments not of resistance, but of despair, proof that silence had been forced, proof that complicity had been demanded. And outside the palace, fathers passed each other in the forum with hollow eyes. Some drowned in wine, others took their own lives with the same swords they once carried in triumph, but most endured, walking the marble halls of Rome as if alive, though their souls had been extinguished in the corridor of torches. The cruelty did not end when the doors closed. Daughters returned unable to meet their father's gaze, not from blame, but from unbearable memory. Families fractured, bonds dissolved, silence became their only language. A father, once the shield of his household, became its destroyer, not because he chose betrayal, but because survival demanded it, and that poisoned every home in Rome. Mothers clutched younger children in terror. Sons eyed their fathers with suspicion, knowing the man who once held the torch might one day hold it again. This was Caligula's true weapon, not steel, not soldiers, love itself, twisted into control. Even after his assassination in 41 CE, when Praetorian blades cut him down in a theater, the wounds he left did not heal, because killing the man could not erase the system. The ledgers remained, the sconces remained, silent bronze monuments to families destroyed, to daughters reduced to numbers. Archaeologists uncovered them centuries later, ledgers where a senator's child was reduced to item 247, cells where noble boys had carved their despair into stone before being remade into feminine attendants. The ruins did not whisper of Rome's glory, they spoke of its shame, not of triumphs, but of torches that once lit the corridors of its moral collapse. Caligula's legacy was not just madness, it was a lesson, how unchecked power, fed with cold bureaucracy, can reduce human beings to instruments, to numbers, to entries in books that outlive their bodies. Rome never recovered from the stain, generations carried it forward. Daughters who flinched at thunder, remembering the stormy nights when screams mingled with lightning. Sons who grew into men unable to lead, because their fathers had been broken into torchbearers. This was the empire's true wound, not politics, not assassination, but scars carved into the soul of its people. And so when we speak today of Caligula's horrors, we are not repeating rumors of decadence. We are staring into the abyss of a system that transformed family into theater, dignity into spectacle, and survival into complicity. The ruins of his palace still stand. The torch holders still line the marble, and in the silence of those empty corridors, the lesson remains. When evil hides behind procedure, when power finds joy in systematic destruction, the end is not only the fall of an emperor, it is the collapse of humanity itself. If this story unsettled you, if it reminded you how fragile civilization becomes when morality is surrendered to madness, then remember, history does not fade. It warns. Like this video, share it with those who dare confront the past, and subscribe for more journeys into the shadows, where power and horror intertwine.